example of this, that there may have been too many loans made, but everyone was competing to get the few good borrowers, right? And in the process, they were making credit available to a lot of people who were very bad credit risks, right? When selection is adverse, there's too little insurance, right? Because people are afraid that they're going to wind up with all the sick people that their competitors currently have. And one very extreme case of this is what's called a death spiral. So this is what a lot of people were fearing would be the case unless people were required under the new health law to purchase health care. Because the idea is that if you don't discriminate at all across people, the adverse selection could be very extreme. And in that case, what could happen is that the price could start here, but then the average people who are willing to sign up at that price could be too costly to justify this price. That could raise the price. Then the people could become too costly again. That could raise the price more, and so forth, and you could just have the whole market collapse, right? Because as you raise the price and serve fewer people, you're serving a more costly population, and in principle, that could just spiral out of control. Another example of that type of thing is what's called Gresham's law, which was the idea that bad money drives out good. So in England, they had two types of coins, and either you couldn't distinguish between them very easily, or you were legally required to use both of the coins to be worth the same amount, which is sort of similar to what happens in the insurance market. You either can't tell whether the person is sick, or it's illegal to discriminate on the pre-existing conditions, right? And under those situations, what happened? Well, everyone hoarded the gold, the really high-quality gold money, and they traded in all the crappy money, because those two things were worth the same, even though they weren't really worth the same. And so everyone held on to the valuable stuff and wouldn't trade, and that sort of led all the good money to come out of the market. So that's the idea. Good money, bad money drives out good. So this was sort of the fundamental fear which justified a lot of the way that the new healthcare law was designed. And Bill, how could we draw a picture of the death spiral? So just to give you a little hint, remember what we kept saying is that no matter what the price is, the average cost of covering people is always higher than that, right? And that leads the price to rise again, right?
Why would it rise a second time?
Because the average cost is higher, right? So we charge this price, this many people come in, the average cost is higher. Well, people can't afford that, so they're going to raise the price higher, right? Because, I can't be charging a price that's below the cost of covering people, right? Otherwise, I'm going to go bankrupt if I'm an insurer.
Right.
Right.
So the price would just keep rising to a point.
So how would we draw that graphically, what I just described?
So your average total cost would sort of be exponential.
Well, it's always going to lie above your demand, right? Because the demand is the price at any given quantity.
Okay, true.
And the average cost, if it always lies above that demand, that's exactly the situation where you have a death spiral. Now, sometimes that's not so bad, because if the average cost is always above the demand, it might still, the market might, be, it might not be worth insuring anyone. But if the marginal cost is below the demand, but the average cost is above the demand, right, then it can be optimal to cover everyone, and yet not anyone gets covered. Yeah?
So when you said that this death spiral relates to the problems that you're talking about, that situation with the vendors and stuff, and when you charge
Yeah, exactly. It's the same thing.
Okay.
So that was exactly a death spiral situation. It was like as we kept raising the tax, the people who were still willing to do the to set up the stands were the people who were doing it in the worst parts of town, and so the whole thing collapses. Yeah.
So either everyone is covered or no one's under a death spiral situation.
Yeah, basically. So the problem is that when there are differences in risk, rather than in people's preferences for insurance, then basically all of the costs are just proportional to people's values, and you can end up with a situation where the average cost curve is everywhere above the marginal cost. So here's an example of the death spiral. If the average cost curve is above the marginal cost curve and the demand curve is in between them, then the social optimum would be to insure everybody, but the market will insure nobody, right? Because if we have these number of people, well then the price has to be this, but then it just kills off the market.
So is that why they want compulsory health insurance?
That was this graph is the argument behind the health law. However, we could also have advantageous selection, where things go in the opposite direction. So this is sort of the most extreme example of adverse selection, but we could also have advantageous selection. So if the marginal cost curve slopes up and the average cost curve slows up, then there will actually be too much insurance, and we'll have this dead weight loss here. Okay, so thus to measure, basically selection is exactly the slope of the cost curve, right? And the slope of the average cost is enough, because we know if we measure the slope of the average cost curve, that gives us the difference between the marginal and the average cost curve, right? And this is exactly the insight of Einov et al.'s 2010 paper. So they went to a large aluminum manufacturer, and they had them offer to different groups 2 plans. The first plan had essentially no health coverage. It was very, very low coverage. And the second plan was had comprehensive coverage. And individual division managers had different prices for choosing the comprehensive over the more limited plan. And they claimed that this was basically random the way it was assigned, but it was actually, it's actually a bit questionable that that was really the case. But if it was randomly assigned to these different groups, that means different groups are facing different prices, right? And so we can just see what is the average cost of covering people when a different fraction of the population buys the coverage, right? And that'll let us exactly measure the average costs at different quantities, right? And this lets them literally just draw out the average cost curve, and then by taking its derivative, you can figure out where the marginal cost curve is, right? And this will tell us how much adverse selection distortion there is. But of course, the total size of the distortion depends on the demand function as well, because if the demand function is really flat, well, then there will be lots of underprovision. If the demand function is really steep, well, then there won't be too much underprovision. So here's what they did. Here are a bunch of division managers. Here are different different prices were offered for the coverage. That led to different quantities. So here's when the price charged was this much, here's how much people demanded. When the price charged was this much, here's how many people demanded, et cetera, et cetera. Each one of those situations, right, for each one of these demand points, you can measure how much did it end up costing the insurer to insure those people. Because you can just audit the books of the insurer and see how much was claimed. And these are these dots right here, right? And then you can just draw, here's only 40% of people are covered, here's 70% of people are covered, a cost curve, which is just a line through those. And that tells you what the average costs of covering people are. Take the derivative of that and you can recover the marginal cost curve, right? And then they drew a demand curve through these as well. And then you have to find equilibrium. So the equilibrium is where the average cost is equal to the demand. The social optimum is where the marginal cost is equal to the demand, which is down here. And the Harburger triangle is this area. Now, I think they cheated a little bit because this looks to me more like it's a concave demand curve than like a real one, than like a linear one. So I think it should intersect about here, so the area should be even smaller. But the basic point is that it actually is quite small in general. So they find that this is about this whole area of the Harburger triangle, far, far, far from being a death spiral, right? To be a death spiral, this demand curve would have to go through the middle of this thing, right? Instead, the demand curve goes way above, and this area is actually quite small. So again, even though the adverse selection losses could in principle be large, it's really important to actually measure these things in practice, the same way Harburger did for the monopoly distortion, and figure out whether they actually are large in practice. Because, for example, a lot of things in the current health law were premised on the idea that adverse selection was a major problem. It may really not be that big of a problem, because some of these advantageous selection things can help offset it and so forth. The same types of approaches that we used to address the distortions caused by average cost pricing, the same sorts of things that helped us get towards marginal cost pricing, could in principle be used here to try to get away from the distortions caused by selection. So, for example, we could provide subsidies for getting more insurance. And does someone want to think about what some of the costs and benefits of that sort of a policy are? Just, they're very, yeah, Michael.
Benefits would be more people would be willing to get insurance.
Yeah.
Cost would be a big governmental or whatever.
Yeah, so all the problems that we had before with subsidies are going to appear here in exactly the same way, right? So anything that you say about, average cost pricing versus marginal cost pricing in regulating a natural monopoly applies to the insurance market pretty much. So while this is a widely advocated policy solution, it requires that we really know the cost function, because otherwise we don't know how much of a subsidy we give, right? We really need to measure the things that Einhorn and Finkelstein, even them, who are these amazing people, had a hard time measuring. There could be a lot of capture of that system, because obviously insurance companies are going to have an incentive to say that there should be more of a subsidy. Anthony, how about mandates for universal coverage? What are some of the advantages and problems with that?
So mandates for universal coverage means that you say everyone has to get insurance.
Which is basically what the new health law in the US has done, right?
Then that would basically be average cost pricing.
No, right? Because it's going to increase the coverage above the point where the market would provide, right?
Oh, yeah.
So look at the Einhorn and Finkelstein graph. Average cost pricing only provides here. Universal coverage
Universal
provide
coverage
there.
provides there, but then you would be having them operate at a point where the marginal,
Yeah, go on.
how is that inefficient? You're making people who don't value insurance at all get insurance. So
Yeah.
there's lots the other way.
So that's exactly right. So here's the market equilibrium. Here's the universal mandate. Here, what do we lose? We lose this little triangle and maybe even less than that. Maybe this little area in here.
On the other side, you lose that.
On the other side, you lose this giant area over here, right? So universal coverage is like a terrible policy in this, right? I mean, that doesn't mean that this is true or that this is true in the U.S. market. But I think there's a pretty strong case to be made that the U.S. policy was hugely inefficient to just mandate that everyone be covered. Yeah.
What type of people are going to be in that dead weight, that new dead weight?
Who shouldn't be covered, you're saying? Well, I mean, here's the problem with covering everyone. When you cover people, they don't take care of their health as well, necessarily, right? And if people don't take care of their health as well, then that can be a real problem, and that can create real social costs.
Couldn't you argue that the people who are valuing the health insurance don't really understand?
That's a good argument. So that if that argument is true, which I think is an important other argument, and in fact, I'm giving a problem set to the price theory students that's a bit related to that. If that's true, that's basically effectively another form of adverse selection. Because that's basically the people who want to get the insurance actually generate this additional social, those who don't want to get the insurance also generate this additional social benefit associated with them getting the insurance. And you could think of that as reducing, an internality that reduces the real social cost of covering them or something like that. So if that's true, that could be a counter-argument. But if we went with this very classical thing where people never make mistakes, then this could be really wasteful. Yeah, Cody?
I was just going to say some people like that would be birth control. Now insurance companies are mandated to give birth control.